time period that we had it for, there's three main sort of conflicts that we've got. So we've got those separately, but most of the outcomes and stuff relates to the whole period. And it's not really the whole thing's not a war because it was an ongoing thing, which is still ongoing today with the whole Israel and Palestine. So again, so the whole conflict, it's wars fought within Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Syria. Conflicts was the Arabs against the Israelis. The Arabs being Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and most of the other Arab nations around there with Soviet backing, fighting against Israel, who had US backing. So that's what 6-day war was.
The first conflict is the 6-day war, and the causes of it was that the Arabs hated the fact that Israel was created after the Second World War because they saw that as their land and they were sought to destroy it. Another cause was the Suez Crisis because this led to UN forces being deployed in the region. This will become more important later on because Egypt was very later on. The Suez Crisis marked the end of colonialism in the period because it meant Arab nations gained like self-determination. They wanted to make their own destiny and have their own power in the region. Another cause is the fact that the US and USSR at the end of colonialism also wanted to have a foothold in the Middle East, which led to NASA striking an arms deal with the USSR, which was about $250 million worth of arms. They also built and funded the Aswan Dam in 1956 along the Nile River. This eventually led to the US supplying weapons to Israel throughout the 1960s. Later on, you have border tensions between Israel, Syria, and Jordan, and Israel attacked both those countries in 1966 and 1967. After this, Nasser gets worried that Israel will invade Egypt, so he expels the UN peacekeeping forces that were there. He closes something called the Straits of Tiran, which Israeli oil ran through, and he amassed troops on the border with Israel, called the Sinai border. The superpowers influence events because most of the Arab forces relied on Soviet weaponry, while the US was less direct. They had supplied Israel weapons in the past. Nasser was said to have had false reports from the Soviet Union that Israel was amassing on their border, so he did the same on his border. Brezhnev also told the Americans that if Israel didn't stop their advance, they would have to intervene themselves. America, after this, pressured Israel into withdrawing from Jordan and Syria to prevent an all-out war between the two superpowers. Overall, they were kind of like mediators of the conflict. They both had like Tente in their mind. They didn't want it to escalate into a larger war, and so they tried to, while they did try to outdo each other in the region, they tried to do this through diplomatic, economic, and aggressive means. The outcome for the countries involved was that Israel took a huge chunk of the Arab territory, like Sinai Peninsula, which is a huge piece of land, from Egypt. They took West Bank and Gaza Strip from Jordan, and Golan Heights from Syria. These wouldn't be determined until much later, until about the 1980s, 90s, I think it would be. The US was seen in the region as the enemy, and so it was very hard for them to try and have any more influence in the region other than in Israel. While it gave the Soviets a lot of support because they were seen as backing the Arabs, and they were seen as anti-Israel. But the dynamic between the US and USSR didn't change much. They had Vietnam on their minds. Like, that was a larger conflict, arguably a larger conflict at the time than this. And so they were trying not to hurt their relations any more than had been done with Vietnam. Crockett says that the impact of the war made the Soviet Union reassess its position. It would eventually lead to greater funding of the Egyptians and more Arab nations, leading to the Yom Kippur War 6 years later, while the United States was viewed as the enemy and more directly funding Israel.
So we go on to the War of Attrition, which starts on March the 8th and ended on September 28th, 1970, with the death of President Nasser. Egypt and Israel engaged in conflict over the lands gained during the Six Day War, as you mentioned. As the outcome, so there's no territory exchanged, as neither side really won, there's no obvious victor. But it could be argued that the Israelis won as the Egyptians aimed to make the land gains but didn't actually make any. And it could be argued that the Egyptians won as there was kind of in the back of the Israeli minds that the Egyptians would attack them at some point, leading up to, as James comes into, the Yom Kippur War. With the superpower balance, there's not really much change because they don't actually come into direct conflict with each other. But the USSR seems happy to alienate America through the arms deal, which you had mentioned with the Six Day War, and as the USSR supports Egypt and the US supports Israel. And it's kind of the idea of vicarious fighting, but they're not actually engaging in conflict with each other, but they're happy to sit there and watch the two Arab and Israeli nations fight each other. And then Macaulay says the Americans were seeking ways to fashion an alliance system in the Middle East to prevent Russian expansion, but always ran up against the problem of Israel. It kind of relates back to in New York during this time there were a lot of protests by American Jews about what was happening in Israel. And if American in Israel would have been a massive uproar in America.
Okay, now I've got the Yom Kippur War, which in this period is probably the most famous one. Similar to what Maya was saying, the War of Attrition is all about Egypt and Syria wanting to claim back land that they had lost in the Six Day War. And again, just part of the continuous Arab-Israeli conflict. And you get also with the land, there's problems with Gaza and the West Bank, with Egypt supporting claims from the PLO and Yasser Arafat. So superpower influence. Both sides were supplying arms and support, but no troops on the ground. USSR were initially and overall quite reluctant to give much support. They were generally giving parts to build rockets or stuff like that. Although this did nearly bring the superpowers into direct conflict, as the US went to stage 3 of alert of stage 5 being nuclear missiles. That was over the Israelis, the Russians had said to the Israelis, if you don't stop attacking, then we'll come in and get the Egyptians out. So for the countries involved, the peace talks that were held at the end were the first meeting of Arab and Israeli officials since 1948. Within Israel, there were several anti-government demonstrations after the war, leading to the resignation of the Prime Minister Golda Meir after inquiries into the start of the war. And Camp David Accords in 1979, which led to the Israel-Egypt peace treaty, was signed, and that resulted in Egypt temporarily being expelled from the Arab League. And then 1977, which was quite a big event, when Sadat, who was the president of Egypt, visited Israel, became the first Arab leader to actually recognise Israel as a country. And for the superpower relationship, closest they've come to war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so that obviously damaged this one quite a lot. But there were no real positive outcomes for the relationship. It was extremely quite damaging to them because it came to conflict. Just two from Crockett. Both superpowers appeared intent on preventing a clear victory by either side. Conscious that changes for a second was acceptable to all parties depends on the degree of balance between them.